Have you been struggling with Path of Exile 2 or just looking for the best way to level up quickly, kill bosses, and absolutely crush the starting campaign? Then this starting build for the warrior class is definitely for you. Hey everybody, welcome back to the channel. HGM here with my version of the best beginner warrior build for Path of Exile 2. We're talking insane damage, great survival, and some surprising mobility that makes this typically slow class feel like a breeze in the game's starting campaign. But that said, there is a bit of setup involved here, which is why I wanted to make this video to get you through the first few acts and off to the best start possible on the warrior class in POE2. As always, timestamps will be provided below if you need to skip around or rewatch a section, and link for the written guide can be found below as well, so let's jump right into it. Starting as always with skills, and on the warrior class it honestly doesn't get much simpler than this with your basic attack called Mace Strike. Now this skill can do a surprising amount of damage quickly with the right weapons and of course the right support gems, but for now you'll simply want to grab a shield and wail away on enemies. Now you'll notice that the mobility on this skill is pretty terrible because it forces you to attack in place, but don't worry, our next skill is going to greatly help with that. And by the way, you do want to switch over to a two-handed mace as soon as possible, mostly for the extra damage, but also some extra stun potential. The shield I don't feel is really that useful in the early game, so the extra damage and stun you can do with that two-hander later on is really a huge advantage, and you'll want to switch over to that as soon as possible. Basically, once you enter Clearfell and can use the merchants. And now eventually you'll want to apply support gems to Mace Strike because it's actually a pretty effective boss killer, especially in Act 1. Gems like Martial Tempo are perfect for this because it increases your attack speed by 25%, letting you get those hits in faster, and eventually Concentrated Effect for another 40% damage bonus. This is going to help us obliterate bosses quickly once they are stunned until we get the Perfect Strike ability a little bit later on. Next up, you should pick up Rolling Slam, which becomes your bread and butter damage dealer early on for getting around maps and clearing away enemies more efficiently. This skill does two slam attacks, one right after the other, while rolling and moving in your preferred direction. The first slam does more stun, while the second attack does greater physical damage. Something to keep in mind with this skill. Also, Rolling Slam is one of the few mace skills in the game that lets you actually move while attacking, so it's a great way to help your beginner warrior feel a little bit more mobile and less stuck in place with those slower mace skill animations. Plus, with the right support gems, you can increase both slams' area of effect, giving a nice AoE damage option right out of the gate, plus a pretty hefty stun. So as far as support gems, I'd recommend two early on, that being Magnified Effect to help you increase that area of damage, and you can combine that with Brutality to give you even more physical damage and faster clearing of enemies with that AoE. And now this skill can be expensive too in terms of mana cost early on, especially if you don't have, some supports on your gear with like mana on kill or extra mana recovery. So another support gem that you might consider instead here if you're having sustain issues would be Inspiration for 40% less skill cost. You can use that early on and that'll let you keep doing Rolling Slam over and over pretty much infinitely at the start of the game. But the next skill you should unlock on your warrior is called Bone Shatter. You can think of this a bit like an AoE execute against enemies that have enough stun built up, sending out a powerful shockwave of damage. And this is basically going to be your finisher for anything that happens to survive your initial Rolling Slam attack, which early on probably won't happen very often, but it will certainly become more useful in the later stages of Act 1 and beyond as enemies begin to get more and more health. Remember that it does damage nearby enemies as well, so all you really need to do is target a single enemy that's primed for stun. You can see that by the glowing orb above their heads, and then watch everything else explode around them. Now usually, like I said, you'll use this skill as a follow-up to Rolling Slam, but keep in mind that you don't have to do the full Rolling Slam animation if you get in trouble or you want to execute Bone Shatter more quickly. Instead, you can do the first slam to get that massive stun and prime your targets, and then you can cancel the second slam with a dodge roll. And this lets you quickly execute everything around you, again using Bone Shatter, and it's really helpful when you get surrounded as well. Speaking of which, you can slot the Execute support gem here if you want a little bit of extra damage, which can be especially useful against rares and bosses who have more health. Our next skill is going to be Shockwave Totem, which has a few different purposes, but it's very useful. Against most normal enemies, this can serve as a distraction and even a buffer, as many times enemies will stop to attack it instead of you, or you can use it to plug up some gaps in hallways and things like that. Now the totem can also deal some pretty decent damage and stun, which makes this another useful tool against bosses because you can do both for you while you reposition or avoid boss mechanics and help those bosses get heavy stunned faster or just deal some extra damage, like I said. Now, in terms of support gems here, I recommend Persistence first. This is going to extend the duration of the totem by 40%. You can also use Overabundance here if you want to have 2 totems out at once, which can be nice for some bosses, but it's not always necessary. You could also use Overpower if you want here for more stun potential. But next up, you should be getting, through Act 1, and you'll pick up your first Spirit Gem and 30 Spirit by defeating the King of the Mists. And this is going to give you access to your first Spirit skill, which I recommend you pick up Herald of Ash. Now, this skill does bonus fire damage in an area based on how much you overkill an enemy. So the greater the killing blow, the more damage you do with Herald of Ash. So this is going to fit perfect on the starting warrior build. It's going to help you deal much more AoE damage for faster clearing through the starting campaign. Now, in terms of support gems, there's not a lot of options here right away. Most of the persistent buff gems you can use on heralds, like greater life recovery or mana recovery, those also cost extra spirit. So not just the 30 base spirit to slot the skill, but like an extra 20 or an extra 10. So you probably won't be able to use those right away unless you have a piece of gear with more spirit. We'll talk about gear in just a few minutes. What you can do is move over the Magnified Effect support gem here because it's slightly more effective to have the greater AoE radius on the Herald versus Rolling Slam. But as I said, once you gain more spirit, either later on in Act 3 or through some additional gear pieces, then you can use gems like Vitality for a bit of life regeneration or Clarity for mana regeneration if you need it. But eventually, near the end of Act 1, when you kill off the Executioner, your boss killer is going to move over to a new skill called Perfect Strike. This skill does massive damage, but you do have to wind it up, so timing is important when using this skill. Basically, the ideas for bosses then is going to be to heavy stun them as much as possible, either by using Mace Strike, Rolling Slam, Shockwave Totem, or a combination of all 3 of those skills. And then once the boss is flat on the ground, you should be able to get in 2 to 3 Perfect Strike attacks, potentially ending the boss fight right then and there, because this can do so much damage. And now, as I said, timing is really important because letting go of the skill at the right moment gets you bonus damage, but that can also be amplified further with the right support gems. So window of opportunity can have the biggest impact here early on. This is going to increase your damage dealt with perfect timing by 50%. You do have to get the timing right in that window, but it does give you a shorter, 25% shorter window as well. So it's going to take a little bit of practice, but I think it's definitely well worth it for the extra damage. You can also move Concentrated Effect here if you want, away from Mace Strike once you do get Perfect Strike, as this will give you significantly more damage than simply spamming your basic attack, and it'll be quicker as well. But one more skill which rounds out your warrior kit nicely can be picked up at the same time as Perfect Strike, and that is called Molten Blast. Molten Blast is going to be your first real ranged skill on the warrior, and it's a good one, especially with the right gem slotted. The only downside of this skill is it does have a slow cast time, so it tends to work best on large maps with like long corridors where you can ideally know that some mobs are coming at you ahead of time to get the skill off, and especially against slower types of enemies like zombies. But the skill is insanely powerful because it can bounce off of nearby enemies and surfaces to create shrapnel explosions, which are going to deal additional damage and have sort of this chain reaction effect. This works even with Herald of Ash slotted for even more fire damage. So for support gems here, Scatter Shot seems to work really well. This is going to give you a wider spread of damage because it's going to send out 3 fireballs instead of 1. And, obviously generating more shrapnel explosions because of that. And then you can also add in something like Fire Infusion early on for even more fire damage. But by the end of Act 1, you should have an amazing kit of skills on the warrior where you start to feel truly powerful. To put things all together, you're going to use Rolling Slam constantly when clearing packs of enemies, powered up with Herald of Ash for even more AoE damage, and finish off anything that survives with the Bone Shatter skill if you need it at that point. But when facing off against rares or bosses, like I said, I like to throw up my 2 Shockwave Totems to serve as a distraction or to apply some extra stuns and damage, while I work on stunning the boss further with some of those quick Mace Strikes or with the Rolling Slam to close the gap towards them. And then obviously once you knock the boss down, you could use Bone Shatter to knock them down as well to initiate that heavy stun, and then immediately charge up 2 to 3 Perfect Strikes. Like we talked about, you get that perfect timing on the boss, and it's going to be a huge amount of damage for each strike that you land. Obviously, dependent on your weapons and your passives, which we're going to go over next. And don't forget, too, you have that ranged option on the warrior with Molten Blast, so that can be insanely powerful in the right situations, which we talked about. Okay, but let's talk about gear next, and specifically what should you be looking for in the early campaign to get your warrior as strong as possible. So first thing, obviously, it comes down to the weapon, and we talked about two-handed Maul being preferable just because these have more damage. They tend to deal more stun as well. And so you'll want something hopefully with an increased physical damage percent. This is not that hard to find. In fact, I recommend that you just gamble on two-handed maces in Clearfell until you get something like this that has increased physical damage. Elemental damage, this one has lightning. We really don't care about that. We want our physical damage as high as possible. Most of the starting warrior skills deal physical damage, and even those that don't, like Perfect Strike, for example, that converts physical damage into fire damage. So really you want as much physical damage as possible. And then you can, of course, put some slots on here. 2 Iron Runes would be ideal because that's going to give you another 40% physical damage on top of whatever you already have. A couple other things to look out for. Life per enemy killed, mana per enemy killed. Those are actually really helpful in the early game, just to help with sustain and to not worry about healing as much. So I recommend those if you happen to see them. And also stun, increased stun build-up can be really good. I happen to find this one pretty early. It's a level 8 mace, and this one had physical damage and increased stun build-up, so this would just like stun bosses in 2 hits, but then it was kind of low level, so I had to just get rid of it eventually. But yeah, stun build-up is really nice too on these two-handed weapons. So those are kind of the stats that you want to look for as far as your main weapon. Now, other pieces that are important, obviously, we always talk about boots in Path of Exile 2. You want as much movement speed as possible on your boots, especially on the warrior class, because you're going to be slower than every other class just because your armor does make you slower. You have negative % movement speed with your armor typically on the warrior class. So again, like 15%, kind of the minimum when you're starting out. Hopefully you can get more than that pretty soon. I'll just mouse over, everything else so you can kind of see what I picked up in the first few acts. Again, physical damage, if you can get bonus physical damage on your rings, attributes on your rings, especially strength early on, or the plus to all attributes, that's very good too. But yeah, physical damage, that's the main damage stat you want to look out for. Increased mana regeneration is actually really good on the warrior. So you can spam Rolling Slam pretty much infinitely. We talked about mana per enemy killed. That's really helpful. Resistances, too. As a melee character, you're going to be getting a lot more damage from elemental damage types. So elemental resistances are always helpful in the campaign. And this chest piece I found is actually really nice because not only is it giving me resistances, strength, increased armor and evasion, but it's also giving spirit. And so if you get anything with extra spirit, that can be helpful to run some extra support gems, either on Herald of Ash, or you can eventually run a second spirit gem, so you have even more options there. But that's basically what I'm running on the beginner warrior setup. Okay, we can talk about passives next. The passive skill tree on the warrior is really simple. Basically, as you start out, melee damage is what you're going to want to look for. So that's pretty easy to get. There's lots of melee damage nodes here at the start. I would just recommend you pick all those up. Head to Brutal, that's going to give you bonus stun buildup and melee damage plus 10 strength, so that's really good. Keep going along that route for even more melee damage, including more melee damage against heavy stunned enemies. Remember we talked about with bosses, you want to build up that stun first, get the heavy stun, and then execute a perfect strike. You're going to get more damage because they're already heavy stunned. In terms of your attributes, strength is your primary attribute. I don't know why it's showing I have so much dex. This is like a visual bug right now on this build. My dex and my strength are switched. You want mostly strength and then, a little bit of intelligence, a little bit of dex, depending on what your gem situation is. So you can obviously change that. It's dependent on your gear too. But the next area you want to head to right away is this two-handed damage area. So 12% increased damage with two-handed weapons. And then I eventually get both of these. So Shockwave This gives 30% increased area effect if you've stunned an enemy, which again, we're stunning all the time. And then, of course, singular purpose, 20% stun buildup and 40% increased damage with two-handed weapons. So that's huge. And then there's a few other places you can start going next. I'm heading over to this melee damage tree right over here. So this has a lot of increased melee damage. And then also increased melee damage against immobilized enemies. And that might be confusing. So when you read about this, immobilized is if a target cannot move. And for example, if they are heavy stunned. So this is basically the same thing as being heavy stunned. So we're still going to be able to get that bonus damage all the way up to, I think it's 50% here, Honorless. Yeah, this gives you 50% increased melee damage against immobilized, or in other words, heavy stunned enemies. Once you knock that out, I would recommend heading over here. This is more of the mercenary side of the tree, but there's a very juicy two-handed damage node here, increased damage with two-handed weapons, so that's similar to what's on the warrior side. Very similar here, increased stun buildup, increased damage with two-handed weapons. I would get that next. And then eventually heading over here to our more specific, mace-focused tree. So that's the setup. If you'd like to see more details, again, I'll have that listed in the written guide so you can kind of see the progression through the early game. But that's it in terms of the beginner warrior build for Path of Exile 2. As I said, you can get more details in the written guide. That's going to be linked down below in the description and the pinned comment. Hopefully you found that helpful. You can also find beginner guides for every single class right now in Path of Exile 2. I've actually just finished up the campaign with all 6 starting classes right now, so I may do some leveling guides on those classes as well. If that's interesting to you, make sure to let me know down in the comments section below. And as always, thanks for watching. Hope you're doing well. Stay safe out there, and I will see you around in the next video.